Today we're going to build a FreeNAS network attached storage. This particular setup is going to be a mini ITX, media streaming, and file storage for a home setup. All of the components we will be using will be listed in the description, and this video will be split up into segments to be able to easily follow along and pick up where you may have left off. The components that were selected for this particular build were used for a reliable, small footprint and power efficient setup that will use a ZFS RAID Z1 storage, which will allow for one drive failure before any data will be lost. There are virtually limitless amount of setups that you could use for a FreeNAS storage, ranging from spare parts you have around your house to large commercial grade servers. We are going to be on the server grade consumer end of things. As you can see, the first thing we need to do is make sure the case is completely torn apart so you can get to the inside and install the motherboard standoffs. Next, we are going to install the I/O backplate for the motherboard. The purpose of the backplate is primarily cosmetic, but it also keeps out dust and debris. This particular build is my own personal NAS that I use for file storage as well as media sharing throughout the house. The easiest way to install the I/O backplate is to press on one of the corners and then press each side as they snap into place. Once you've got it installed, go around and press each side, make sure it's securely fastened and snapped in, otherwise the motherboard will not fit very well. Next, we are going to install the motherboard. Make sure you get some of the cables out of the way. The motherboard will fit into the I/O backplate that you just installed. That's where all the USB ports, the HDMI or VGA adapters, LAN adapters will fit through there. There will be some tabs across the top part of the plate. So if you're having trouble getting it situated into place, those tabs need to be over the top of the input and output components on the motherboard. If you're having troubles getting the holes to line up with the standoffs, those could be in your way. Once you have your motherboard in place, it's time to install the mounting screws. When you're tightening these screws down, do not tighten them securely until you have all of them in, and then you can go ahead and tighten them down all the way. Be sure that when you get to the point to where you're ready to tighten these down all the way, that you tighten them snugly, but not hard enough that you're going to crack or damage the board in any way. And that's all there is to installing the motherboard. Check out the next video for installing the CPU and the heatsink. Part 2 of our FreeNAS build will be the CPU and heatsink installation. The first thing that we need to do is remove the plastic plate that protects the pins for the CPU socket on the motherboard. To do that, all we need to do is release the retention bracket. All you have to do is press down and pull out on the locking arm that holds the bracket in place, and then easily pull out the plastic piece. The CPU itself will only fit in the socket one way. There are two small divots on the sides of the CPU, which will be towards the back side of the motherboard where the input-output ports are. All you need to do is gently drop the CPU in place and pull down the retaining bracket and lock the arm in place. As you're pulling the lever down and the bracket tightens, it may sound like it's hurting the CPU, but don't worry, it's not. Another tip is that on the CPU there is a small gold arrow or triangle in the corner, which corresponds with a small triangle that's on the bracket you can see there in the bottom right. I decided to use some aftermarket thermal paste, some Arctic Silver 5. However, the heatsink that comes with the CPU already comes with pre-applied thermal paste, which would be just fine. Prior to this application, I removed the thermal paste that came on the heatsink. I obviously didn't show that part in the video. If you decide to clean the thermal paste off the heatsink and use some aftermarket thermal paste, I highly recommend using the Arctic Silver Arctic-Clean kit for removing the thermal paste and purifying the surfaces. The stock Intel CPU cooler and heatsink is very easy to install. Prior to snapping it into place, I recommend taking each one of those black studs and turning them to the left to make sure that they are in the loosened position so that the anchors can be easily pressed through and secured. This installation is quite easy. All you need to do is press each one of these four corners down until it clicks through and twist it to the right, and it'll lock the anchor into place. After you press in one of the corners, you'll want to jump to the complete opposite side and press that corner in and secure it, especially if you're using aftermarket paste, so the thermal paste will spread out evenly. It's not as crucial if you're using the stock paste. Thanks for watching. Now it's time for part 3, the power supply unit installation. I would recommend a gold or platinum rated PSU as it will be running nearly 24/7. Generally I prefer a modular power supply, however for this particular build I went with a non-modular PSU because of the power cable connectors can take up some extra space and you don't have a lot of room for this type of a fit on an ITX case, and especially in this Fractal Node 304. You'll notice this is a unique mounting of a power supply. It sits in sideways, and you will see that there's an extension cable that you actually connect to the power supply that allows you to plug your computer in from the back. The first thing that we need to do is set the power supply in place and mount it with these screws that came either with your power supply unit or with the case itself. Another thing that is unique about this mounting is that there are only 3 screws that you will be able to use to mount it. There won't be a 4th like in a normal setup. And you can see there's a cutout area to be able to fit a screwdriver to tighten down the 3rd screw on the bottom. Once the PSU is firmly seated and secured with the mounting screws, you will take the extension cable and plug it in. You'll probably have to wrap the cord around to make it fit. All this does is allow you to plug your power cable into the back of the computer once you're done. And that's all it takes to install the power supply. Next, we will install the RAM. Thanks for watching. Part 4 of the build will be the RAM installation. When selecting memory for this build, I went with ECC, which stands for Error Correcting Code Memory. ECC RAM will fix some types of file corruption. I selected this RAM because I have data that I don't want to lose. The cost is a little bit higher, but for me it was worth it. For your build it may not be. That's a decision you're going to have to make on your own. It is important to note that the rest of your hardware must be compatible to be able to utilize this type of RAM. No matter which type you use, the installation is the same. All you do is press back the retaining clip for your RAM chip, and it will only fit in one way. Make sure that the notch on the bottom side of the memory is lined up with the socket. And as you insert it, make sure that you're pressing it in level and press down firmly. And once the retaining clip clicks into place, you're done. Thanks for watching. Part 5 of our FreeNAS build will be the cabling and wiring of the entire system, less the hard drives. In the next part, being part 6, that will be the final section of this build guide, and in that part we will install the hard drives and connect them. But for now we are going to connect the motherboard and all of the cooling fans, as well as the front panel power button and lights. The first thing that you'll want to do is unwrap all of your cabling and stretch them out. It makes it a lot easier if you pull your cables out and separate them all so you can see what you're working with. First, we're going to knock out the Big Daddy, the 24-pin motherboard power connector. This is going to be the most obvious connection we're going to make here. It'll plug into the 24-pin motherboard power connector, which is actually located on the top of the motherboard. On a normal motherboard, this connection would be on the right side if you're looking at the motherboard from this angle. It's also a good idea while you're making these connections to remember that you're going to have to route these cables around. Especially in an ITX build like this, you're not going to have a lot of space for all these cables, so you'll want to think ahead about where you're going to want these cables to tie them off and make sure they're not going to come close to any fans. And also remember there's going to be some hard drives hanging above the power supply unit. Next, we're going to attach the CPU power connection. This is actually a 4+4 power connector that we're going to use. We're only going to use one of the 4-pin power connectors for this. And again, contrary to a typical ATX motherboard, this connection is going to be in the lower right where it would normally be in the top left corner of the motherboard. Next, we're going to connect the front panel USB 3.0 connector. This connection actually resides in the normal spot on a motherboard, which is on the center right side of the board. You'll notice that on the female socket on the motherboard there is a small notch. There is also a small pin on the cable that will fit into that notch, so make sure that you're plugging this in the correct way, otherwise you may bend one of the motherboard pins. I wish there was a way that they would make this a more secure connection. This really kind of sits in there loosely, but that's pretty common with any setup. Next, we are going to use the headers for the power switch, the HDD LED, and also the power LED. First, we're installing the hard disk drive LED connector. You'll notice on the small diagram in the bottom left corner that the HDD LED connector goes in the bottom right corner of the header. Next are the power LEDs. This will be the blue light that comes on when your computer is on. If you really want to keep your build a low profile build, you don't need to actually connect either of these last two connections. This one will just let you know that your computer is on, and the hard drive LEDs will let you know when the disks are being accessed. The hard drive LED is white. Again, pay attention to the diagram. The hard drive LEDs will be in the top left, and next we're going to connect the power switch, which of course this is going to be necessary to power on your computer. This particular connection will be located on the bottom left corner of the header. One interesting note is that on this particular case there is no reset switch, so there is no connection that we're going to make for that, so that part of the header will just be left untouched. Next, we are going to connect the CPU cooling fan. You'll need to unravel and unclip the cable from the CPU cooler. It's also very important to remember here to make sure that that wire does not come in contact with the fan blades, otherwise it may stop the fan from spinning and cause your CPU to overheat. When connecting this fan to the motherboard, make sure that you connect it to the CPU PWM fan header. This is important to do to make sure that the fan speeds fluctuate with the temperature of the CPU itself. The fan connection will only fit one way. There is a small clip on the motherboard that will fit in the notch of the fan connector. We are going to continue on installing fans, and we are going to connect the 3 case fans to the fan controller that is on the back of the case. There is a 3-way splitter for the power of the fans. The great thing about this fan controller on the back is that you can change the fan speed of your fans on the fly. You're welcome to connect your fans to the motherboard headers if you want to, and control the fans through the motherboard BIOS settings. However, I preferred to use the fan controller on the back, since in this NAS build I just leave mine on the lowest setting for quiet operation. Unless your FreeNAS server is sitting somewhere where it's going to get very warm, there's really no need to put this setting on anything above the lower the medium setting. You will notice with 3 hard drives in your setup, your temperatures are going to stay pretty cool. Now if you've got 6 hard drives in here running, that temperature may go up. You may want to monitor your motherboard and CPU and hard drive temperatures if you have 6 full-size 3.5-inch hard drives installed. I've not had the need to put 6 in here yet, so I haven't been able to test that myself. I would imagine the temperatures would be fine, but you may want to check that if you do have 6 drives installed. Now that we have the fans connected, it's time to connect our Molex power connector to power these fans. When connecting your fans to the splitter, it makes no difference which cable you connect them to. All the fan controller does is regulate the voltage at which the fans will receive power. Therefore, it will also control the speed at which the fans spin, but we have to send the power to the controller, which is why we are connecting this Molex connector to it. If you've ever worked with Molex power connectors before, they are a royal pain. Sometimes they won't line up correctly, sometimes they're loose, and sometimes you can bend the connections, so be careful when you're connecting these and pay attention to what you're doing and make sure the wires are all lined up with one another. Now that we have everything connected, we need to organize and sort out where we are going to store these cables and wires while this thing is running. This part of the build can be quite subjective, so it's really up to you how you want to run your cables and wires. So have fun with it, and remember to keep all of your wires out of the range of moving parts, and also remember that you're going to have some hard drive cages hanging above the power supply unit itself. Go ahead and place your cables in the area you think you're going to permanently store them, and we will prepare to install the hard drives and hard drive cages next. After the hard drives are installed, we will then use cable ties, zip ties, whatever you want to hold the cables all into place and make your new FreeNAS server looking as neat as possible. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. This is part 6 and the final step in the assembly of our FreeNAS home server build. Now it's time to install the storage media. I went with 3 3TB Seagate NAS drives, which I then set up in a RAID Z1 ZFS setup. The benefit of using a ZFS storage type is that if one of your drives fails, they are all striped with parts of your data, so if one of the drives does fail, you are able to remove it and replace it with a new drive, and the other 2 drives will stripe that new drive with the missing information, and none of your data will be lost. First, you'll want to take one of your hard drive cages, place your hard drive in it, making sure that your SATA power and SATA data connection will be towards the back part of the drive cage itself. And then all you have to do is line up the holes with the anti-vibration mounting grommets that come with the Fractal Node 304 drive mounting cages, and then lock the drive into place with your 4 mounting screws that should have also come with the case. The screws that you will be mounting you can kind of see in the bottom right corner there, but they have the extra large flat pan head on them. You can see by these drive cages the reason I selected this particular case and why a lot of people use this case for a NAS build. It's able to hold 6 full-size 3.5-inch hard drives, as well as a custom mounting if you take a couple of 2.5-inch drives that can be mounted on the outside of the 2 outside cages. The anti-vibration little grommets that come with this case are excellent. They help to hold the drive in place securely, And also when the drives spin up, also keep them from rattling or making any noise. Now when mounting these drives, I tried to mount them all on the exact same side so there was the same amount of airspace between each of them. It's probably not that necessary, but I am pretty particular about that kind of thing, so I made sure to do that. And if you only have 3 drives, definitely only put 1 drive per cage to make sure that there's plenty of airflow passing over each of the drives. Obviously, if you have more than 3, you're going to have a couple of them stuffed into one, but you should still have plenty of airflow by the way the case is set up and the fans that are directly blowing upon them. Now, if you do have more than 3 of these drives, it's much better for you to use a RAID Z2 or 3 setup. For RAID Z2, it is required to have a minimum of 4 drives, and in a perfect world, you would actually be using this. I only had 3 drives for this build, so I had to use a RAID Z1. And it's likely that I'm going to add another drive and go to RAID Z2. The reason for this is that there is a larger likelihood with drives over 1 terabyte in a RAID Z1 setup to come up with bad sectors and file corruption. If you want a technical explanation of all this, you can find lots of posts on the internet. Just do a web search and you can find all the technical information about how that works. I'm not going to get into that though. Now that the hard drives are mounted into the cages, we will install them into the case. You'll drop them into place. There are 2 thumb screws that go into the back. I recommend leaving them sort of loose until you get that small screw in the front tightened down into place, because it can be a bit of a fight sometimes if the holes don't line up right. Once all 3 screws are in, then you can go back and tighten them all down firmly. Once you have all the screws on the first drive tightened down, it's time to drop in the next one. And you can see as we start to put these drive cages back in, we start to lose a lot of space within the case, which is why the cable and wire management is so important and crucial. And you'll definitely notice this after we get the 3 SATA cables connected to the hard drives as well as the SATA power cables. And then we drop in the 3rd and final cage and tighten it down like the other 2, putting all the screws in loosely first and then going back through and tightening all of them down. And make sure that as you're installing these that you're not getting cables caught underneath the drives or within the cages. In any build, I always try to keep the cabling and wiring out of the center area of the case and off to the sides. And it helps when you think about this. Think about the airflow, how it's moving through the case. You want to keep any obstructions and things out of the way. They're going to reduce or stop your airflow to getting to the parts that need to be cooled. And once the hard drives are installed, that's pretty much it. Everything is installed, and the next part is probably one of the longest procedures, and that is going to be the cable routing and cable management. And this part is really up to you. You can run your cabling and wires however you want, as long as you make sure that they're not obstructing airflow through the case and they're not going to get into any moving parts. It is very important here to use cable ties or twisty ties or whatever you want to lock the cables in place so they do not move and get caught up in fans and things like that. And right now I am connecting the SATA power and data cables to each of the hard drives. And then eventually, once all of these are done, it's time to route all of your cabling through the case and tie them all off. Check out the motherboard manual if you would like to connect your drives to the SATA 0, 1, 2, and 3 ports on your motherboard. I actually did this with each of my drives, so I knew when I was looking in the BIOS settings or within the FreeNAS database which drive I was actually speaking to when I was setting it up. It can also be very helpful if you have a drive fail, if you have each of the cables or each of the drives labeled so you know which one actually needs replaced when you go to physically remove it. You may notice that I use a lot of twisty ties. I usually tinker with my PCs and other hardware, and don't like to use cable ties just because I don't like to clip them off every time that I'm inside my cases. I like to use a twisty tie so I can remove it. I wish I could use cable ties, but I like to tinker too much. Cable ties are definitely a much better option than using twisty ties because then you've got extra wire hanging around that you can't clip. But I'm always inside my cases and messing around with wiring and putting in new parts and swapping out old parts, and it's just a lot easier for me to use twisty ties. Moral of the story is, use whatever's best for you. If you're not going to be inside this very much after you've got it completed, use zip ties. And if you do use twisty ties, like I use, be very careful, since the core of those are always metal. Make sure they're not going to touch anything electrical that's going to conduct electricity or conduct heat, and keep them as far away from any delicate components as possible. And it helps to take the ends that are hanging off of them that are left over and just keep wrapping them around whatever cable or wire you're using twisty ties to tie together, and wrap them all the way around so there's nothing hanging off out into the open. And if you can't tell by now, I am just rambling on to fill dead air, but I will stop now and let you listen to the last 45 seconds of music. Thanks for watching. Feel free to leave comments, subscribe, and if you'd like to see me set up a FreeNAS storage, feel free to leave that in the comments. Thanks for watching.